All right, you're back. Yeah, I don't hear the echo anymore. I don't hear the echo anymore.
So it is my audio recording. I turn off every time I'm in here. Okay.
Okay. Very good. So yeah, all right. Well, welcome. And yeah, it sounds good. You could do some exercise while we talk about different topics. And
yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if Jesse's going to show up today, but we'll see. So welcome to the meeting. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll be talking about a number of different topics today. There he is. Hi. Oh, you're breaking apart, Jesse. Okay, he's going to come back in. Yeah, so we'll be reviewing a number of topics today, catching up on some things. We have, of course, the talk coming up for the cognitive offloading, and that's coming for, that's forthcoming. This week has been pretty busy with...
Right, have a slideshow.
What was that?
We're making slides for it right now, right?
Yeah, I'm going to go over them. But yeah, I'll probably put them up right after the meeting. And so I know they put them up before, but they've changed since then. So
Gotcha.
All right. So yeah, I don't know what's going on with Jesse's connection, but when he comes in, we'll yeah. So let me start with the Slack channel or the Slack review. Alright. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Alright. So, not a huge amount of things going on in the Slack. In terms of the CogSci discussion group, we're kind of ground to a halt this week. So, we'll try to catch up on that. We have a couple more weeks to prepare for that. We got, and I'll show you in another channel that we have probably about 12 attendees already scheduled to attend.
Cool.
So, yeah, and I think, Daniela is one of the attendees signed up already. There are a bunch of people I didn't recognize, but they're probably from the conference. All right, welcome back, Jesse. Okay. But that's good. We're making progress on that end. Let's see. We're looking at what about ethics, tech, and society. So in ethics, tech, and society, we have a couple things. This article by Abiba Burhani on out of the most they did a study of the 100 most influential ML papers. And they only found 2 that mention potential negative impacts, one in passing. So this is an article that they wrote, and they basically looked across ML papers and looked for papers that mention the negative impacts of what they were doing. So most papers focus strictly on the technical sort of details or the positive aspects. And they couldn't, there just really isn't much discussion, at least in the mainstream literature, on negative impacts. So that's something to think about. So this is, I think, the article here, VentureBeat. And so this is an article in an effort to document the factors influencing AI research. Researchers at Stanford, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Washington, University of College Dublin, and Lero surveyed 100 highly cited studies. I don't know what cited are okay. They surveyed, I guess this is the link to this paper here, 100 highly cited studies submitted to 2 prominent AI conferences, NeuroSim and ICML. The claim that is in the papers they analyzed, which were published from 08 to 19, or actually 08, 09, 18, and 19. I guess they're trying to get a 10-year comparison between these 2 years and these 2 years. The dominant values are operationalized in ways that centralize power, disproportionately benefiting corporations while neglecting society's least advantaged. And so this is they kind of go on about the different things they found in their survey. So I guess they just reviewed a bunch of papers from these data points, and they found that over 2/3 didn't make any mention of societal needs or impact, and just 3% made an attempt to identify links connecting their research to societal needs. So that's, you can check that out if you're interested. Any comments about that? Okay. So let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi. Yeah, sorry. My connection was a bit. I had to change what I was connected to.
Okay.
That may be that active today, but I should be here the whole time. So.
Okay. All right. I didn't know if you wanted to make a comment about the last paper or the last thing we reviewed.
Not particularly, but there's still kind of a general either database or collection of stuff for the Ethics and Society team that I'm working on putting together, and I'd like to be fleshing out those things. That, I don't know if Erin's going to be here today or not, but she's got some important things going on, which is good for her. But I think there will be a grouping on that front in the near future that might not be right now.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I know we were going to meet with Erin at some point. We haven't been able to make that connection yet, but yeah, we were talking earlier about the Cognition Futures event and the Trajectories event. So we have a couple more weeks on that to get that going. We have some attendees already, so we're making progress. So let's see if there's anything else here. So this is there's nothing really in this channel. Open chat forum, that's where it was. Okay, so there were a couple things in this channel, and this was something I missed from last week, and this was something that Jesse posted. I don't know if it was from, looks like it's from a dark view of one of the social media networks. So this is Monica Anderson. I have decided to evangelize these points in discussions about GA's genetic algorithms. So she lists a bunch of things on it, and Jesse says in the chat here, I'd be curious to hear Bradley's take on this with respect to genetic algorithms. So this is a number of things that she's pointing out here. Number one is recombination is much more important than mutation. Two is that in the recombination there must be some chance for the offspring to inherit the genes that make the parents excel. Three is some people think evolution is slow because nature took millions of years to evolve anything, but nature runs generally at 1 generation per year. A genetic algorithm can run 100 generations over a population of thousands per core in a second. 4 genetic algorithms define the simplest class of computer algorithms capable of any kind of epistemic reduction. This means the algorithm can discover something the programmer didn't themselves know how to search for. So she talks about epistemic reduction in a blog post here. Genetic algorithms have nothing to do with genetics in the sense of genomics, but people familiar with genomics can immediately see the value of GAs and adopt them more often. And because the algorithms are the same algorithms used in the problem domain, and that's unusual, fortuitous, and confusing. So failure to heed 1 and 2, which are these points here, makes your GA work by degrading itself to a pure random search. So this is an interesting point. Lots of people get turned off from GAs because they look too slow. when in reality their implementation is one of the aforementioned bugs. So yeah, this is an interesting post. I agree with this point about recombination. I don't know if it's more important than mutation. It's certainly not. The problem with recombination is that if you do too much recombination in your genetic algorithm, you end up with, basically reshuffling the solutions that you've come up with. So if you're not familiar with what genetic algorithms are, they're algorithms that we use some sort of artificial genome, which is, essentially consisting of a binary string or some sort of string of values that we can operate on computationally. We can divide these into genes. We can encode things that we want to solve in our problem domain. So say, for example, we want to evolve a bunch of shapes, and you want to find interesting shapes and then select for the best shapes. We can encode like the geometry of these shapes in the chromosome, what they call the chromosome, which is a string. So they're using this analogy with genetics. So you can encode it on the chromosome. You can have separate genes. You can even express the genes in different ways. But basically, it's this: you go back to the string and you're like basically transcribing it into something. But you're evolving the string so that it's generating different values at different points. So unlike a neural network where you're pushing things through the network and you're adjusting the weights, you have to do things to the string to modify it so that it'll generate different types of solutions over time. One of those, of course, is selection. So you have a population of strings and you select for the strings that are the best, that give you the best result. Two is that you can introduce mutation, which is you can change a value on the string, like 1 bit. You can flip a bit or you can flip a series of bits. And then recombination is where you can take different parts of the string and swap them around in order. So recombination is often done in nature with organisms where different pieces of DNA are swapped around, and it actually is something that drives innovation. If you want to read, if you get into the genetics literature, you'll find that recombination happens, but it depends on the species. Sometimes it's at a very low rate because there are things that we don't want to throw the DNA all over to different parts of the genome. As it turns out, there are a lot of functional traits that are linked physically. So recombining, having mass recombination events can basically destroy the architecture of your organism. So I think in my other group we've talked about Hox genes, which have this collinear property. And so that collinearity is really there because it's trying to work against recombination and keep recombination at bay, or from pulling apart what is otherwise a very dependent system. So I think, recombination is important to put into your algorithm, but you don't want to rely on it too much. Mutation is important, and of course, in genetic algorithms, you can reset the mutation rate to whatever you want. The problem, again, with a high mutation rate is that when you do find solutions to things, you can often mutate away from them. So if you think about them in a fitness landscape setting, or a landscape like, we see loss landscapes in genetic algorithms, with loss landscapes, you're trying to minimize the energy. And with a GEA landscape, you're trying to maximize the fitness. But it's the same principle. You're trying to go to a maximum point. And with mutation, as well as recombination, if you do too much of it, you can, basically work against yourself in trying to reach those, those minimax points. So instead of reaching the top of instead of exploring gradually and then getting to the top of your fitness peak, you end up constantly, sort of backsliding along the hill towards your fitness peak, and you never make it there. So that's an interesting point. The second point, in the recombination event, there must be some chance for the offspring to inherit their genes to make their parents excel. So you have to have, unlike a neural network, or sometimes, in our developmental Bradenberg vehicles, we take a population approach to that. But you have to have a population of these different strings. So they're just basically different versions of the algorithm, or different versions of the string that run under the same algorithm. You have to have a population that's big enough so that you have a lot of variation. You have mutations in different strings that are different from other strings, so that there's some variation that you can select one over the other and make a reasonable judgment about that. But also that you have parents that are selected for that are fit, and then the children inherit that, and then they continue that lineage on. So there's this thing that people do called experimental evolution, and I wrote a paper on this several years ago where I did a bunch of experiments with C. elegans that have fairly short generation times. And you would just pick for a trait. You would select for a trait that you defined in advance. It had to do with reproductive fecundity. And then the worms that were the best at that were promoted, and then they were allowed to continue on their lineage. And so if you trace those lineages out, you see that there's a slow and steady increase in fecundity over a number of generations. That's the kind of trend that you might expect if you're selecting, there's some sort of positive selection going on. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for. And again, you're climbing that fitness peak. You're climbing to the fitness peak that you want. You're not backsliding. If you don't have a clear sort of fitness criterion and don't select the most fit organisms, or the ones that have some clear advantage over other, in this case, strings, then you don't get this kind of effect. So, yeah, I think I agree with 3, too, is that some people think evolution is slow because it took nature millions of years to evolve anything. The nature generally runs at 1 generation per year. That depends on the organism. Sometimes generations can occur like within a couple hours. Sometimes it takes like a couple days. Sometimes it could take like 20 years, depending on the organism. But generally, the generation is like subjective, right? Like, in a genetic algorithm, generations occur very quickly. And one of the things we found from the C. elegans study was that there's actually a lot of variation being generated, because in your C. elegans setup, you have a culture of C. elegans, and each culture has maybe about 200 to 300 worms potentially that mature, grow to maturity. And so if you pick, you grow them to just before they start reproducing. But even then, you can have 2 to maybe 200 worms per single parent. So you have these, you have this large group, and a lot of them are, I guess you could call it quasi-clonal. But they do generate a lot of sort of random mutations, and even some recombination. So you're drawing from a pool of 200 individual variants. And then you have like a number of those across generations. So you're actually just, there's a massive increase in the complexity there to choose from over time. So it's something that's very different from a neural network, where you're adjusting the weights, and there are a lot of combinations for the weights that could be possible. But with genetic algorithms, you're really you have a combinatorial space of different possibilities, and you're just selecting different pathways through that. I'll have to do a more formal presentation on this at some point, because some of these things I'm saying need like visualizations to go along with it. But I think, some of these, GAs are very, they can be slow relative to what? Relative to neural networks, perhaps, but they still do produce good solutions. And I think with cloud computing and some of the other things like multi-core computing now that we have, I think we can really take a good shot at this. And I think it's a lot easier to implement them than it used to be. And this idea of epistemic reduction is interesting. So this means the algorithm can discover something the programmer didn't themselves know how to search for. So this sounds like sort of generativity that we talk about. But I think that's interesting because, genetic algorithms actually start out with you creating a representation. And so this is a representation of the problem in the form of like a genome. So it's this language of genetics, but you're using that language to describe something in the world that you want to encode the properties of. And then you're going to evolve that so you can even visualize the outputs and map different parts of the chromosome to different parts of the output. Like again with the genetic or with the geometric shape example, it could be different parts of the geometric shape, like rims and circles and squares and so. But you can also generate new versions of that. So it kind of breaks your representation down a bit. What you have as a representation is your epistemology of the object. So, if I take a shape like a mug or like a sculpture, and I know, like, I have descriptions for the shapes, like I say, this looks like a Venus, or this looks like some sort of box, or this looks like some sort of, clown, shape, looks like a clown or something, we give a description to it. Those descriptions break down and they start generating variants. So like, you have something that's generated based on that template that looks sort of like the original, but it's not. And so you could see how over evolutionary time you could drift to something that's totally different. Much like, if you look at the tree of life, you see things that have a common ancestor that look nothing alike. And the reason is because you had this sort of early, this ancestral version that diversified over time, and they drifted apart in terms of what they looked like, so that they look nothing alike after a certain amount of time. So, and that definitely breaks your sort of knowledge of what objects are. If you think about, like, if you were looking at that process in real time, you would have to describe the outputs at every point, and at some point it would just become untenable to say, to use the same sort of framework. I mean, that's my take on it. I think that's a really interesting idea, though. This number 5 is talking about genetics in the sense of genomics. So it isn't genetics. It doesn't have nothing to do with it, but it's definitely different. And it's that same language. And so you can understand it as a geneticist, or a genomicist. But yeah, there are a lot of differences, and sometimes it gets a little bit confusing if you're familiar with the rules of genetics, but it's actually pretty. I wonder what the comparison is between that and between neuroscientists who use neural networks, because maybe it's a similar thing, right? We talk about the difference between artificial neural networks and biological neural networks, and maybe there's that same difference there. So yeah, and so this idea of failure to heed 1 and 2 makes your GA work by degrading itself to a pure random search. So yeah, the idea of a random search is just basically a random search with mutations. So if you're, the analogy with neural networks would be that you would have like this network with, you're just modifying the weights randomly, which would be like the equivalent of introducing random mutation into these strings, is that there isn't really a lot of pressure. The only pressure would be the selection pressure, which isn't really, you're selecting on things that are being generated very randomly. And so there are a lot of tricks one can use to make this process better. There is an issue with like the fact that nature is sort of open-ended in terms of evolution, whereas genetic algorithms are not as open-ended in some ways, because you're sort of determining the target of what you want. So it's like, artificial selection, like animal breeding, instead of like natural evolution. But these are all interesting points. I think this is something we should revisit. I don't know. Again, like, I think we need some more visualizations of it, but I think this is something the lab has done in the past, and we need to think about it a little bit more. I'd like to go back into it a bit more, and yeah, there's a lot to synthesize there. This article, Why Some Biologists and Ecologists Think Social Media is a Risk to Humanity. This was a article that I actually saw on Twitter This is Carl Bergstrom, who's actually a evolutionary biologist, and there are a couple other people who were on this paper. This is about a paper that looks at social media and its phenomenon as a phenomenon that has, let me see if I can click through the Vox link, that has a lot of dangers that we're not really properly categorizing. So a group of 17 researchers across disciplines from biology to philosophy published a paper arguing that the impacts of social media should be treated as a crisis discipline. So this is the idea that there's this sort of crisis that we're not really aware of. We're not really appreciating the scope of the crisis that it's introducing. So, introducing new technologies often brings a lot of social, sort of social consequences, and sometimes it brings a number of social crises that are not really thought of when the technology is being brought to bear. So, when you invent, say, like the automobile, there were a lot of coattails from automobiles becoming diffused in the population, people adopting automobiles. I mean, there's the old adage of the buggy whip manufacturer went out of business, but you also had pollution, you also had other types of social changes that were associated with it. So this paper is called Stewardship of Global Collective Behavior. And so a crisis discipline is a field in which scientists across different fields work quickly to address an urgent societal problem, like how conservation biology tries to protect endangered species or climate science research aims to stop global warming. So we don't really understand the collective behavioral effects of this new technology, and that's a danger to democracy and scientific progress. So this is an interesting article, and then the paper link is here, and it's a PNAS paper, so you can read that. It looks like a pretty good paper. So I'm not really sure we have anything else here to talk about. Yeah, nothing new anyways. I think we have covered everything. Let me see if there's anything in papers. Nope. Okay, so that's all we have on that. Any comments or questions or things we should talk about stemming from that?
I'm pretty sure going over the genetic algorithm stuff, I was very curious what you'd say about that.
Yeah.
But everything else was interesting too. I'm glad that happened.
Yeah. So good. So that's the Slack review. To the Cognition Futures event, and I wanted to. I think I talked about how there were about 12 people signed up. I got an email earlier this week talking about, how we have a list of people already. So a lot of those people I think are in the going to the CogSci conference. But I think I saw Daniela there. I don't know if she's going to the CogSci conference or if she signed up as a person who gets our weekly emails. But this is our website, a Notion site, and I see that there's been some progress made on it. We need, of course, we have some notes here, links to notes. We have the Neuromatch Academy link, and I'll have more to say about that later. So I guess, the idea here is we want to make sure that this is something that if people come to this event, they can go to this website and it'll be a companion to what they're doing, or it gives them more information about what the lab is doing in this general area. So I think it looks decent. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to be heavy-handed about it. I don't even, it's like one of those things that you just kind of want to put together some resources. It's not something you have to perfect. But we have our team here, and so I guess we'll be next week. Maybe we'll go over some more detail about how we're gonna sort of approach everything, the different components to it, scheduling wise, and just to get a sense of where we are on that, so that everyone can be prepared and we can have a good glitch-free session.
Yeah, if there's anything, I'm open to suggestions for what should be on the site itself. Yeah, I should put that on my list of things to do. Like even for, I think even if I just keep it on Notion, I might make the splash page itself even like kind of like, hey, exercise 2021, please come to this link. And then on that page that we saw, like I think maybe having a tentative outline or something more, like not just a project, but like even a very simple, what to expect kind of a thing might be good. So I'm open to suggestions about what should be on there. Wait, I can edit it a little bit now actually.
Yeah, by all means, that would be great. Again, like I think we should put the CogSci branding. I think we should put the lab branding, just the logos, and then to have like some, maybe we'll have a schedule, like where we just kind of lay out. And this doesn't have to be done now, but like a table that would give like a schedule. This is what we plan to cover. We have a couple people who are interested in different things, and I know that giving people 10 minutes each, if you had 5 people, that would take up most of your time. So you may not want to do it that way, but just kind of give short, just talk about some topic, if that's something we're going to do, or go through the trajectories like we mentioned I think a week or two ago. So all those things we can do, those are possible activities that we can do. So yeah, I think that would be great. And then I think also the resources that we can use. I don't know what kind of resources there are right now. I know we have we don't really have a web resource for this stuff, really, but we can kind of come up with things we can have a link to state-of-the-art AI. I've been pretty impressed with some of the stuff I've seen from Jesse, and I know he has a newsletter, and they have a Twitter feed, so that's all good stuff, which you've been showcasing, the different papers and the things like that. So that might be some way to, kind of leverage a lot of that stuff to, as a resource for people, to give them a flavor of how this might work. How would we build a trajectory? I mean, we can do it by hand, or we can do it by, the method that maybe we introduce to people and say, this is basically how we define a trajectory. But also, state-of-the-art AI is doing this in terms of trying to get a handle on the intellectual diversity of a specific field. So it lends itself to a good example right off the bat. You don't have to work too hard to get that example, but it's a nice way to look at it.
Okay, I'm just going to be playing around with that right now, I think. Just to kind of give it some... A little bit more... Let people know what's actually happening.
Yeah, that would be good. Let me see if I can find... Okay, share your screen. So, yeah, this is oh, there we go. Things are starting to look up already on the editing front. Okay, so that's our website there, and so yeah, we have our GitHub. We also have our GitHub organization. So we haven't visited this in a while, but it's definitely still here. And I want to remind people that we have an archive of all the meetings, I think back from last August. So we have all these different meetings, and they're not fully annotated, but you can link through, and you can get the Twitter link, the Twitter thread, which generally includes the link to the video and other resources. There's this meeting recording, which is on YouTube. And then if there was a presentation that week, the presentation link will be here. There are also supplemental notes that I don't know, this is like revisiting things. So these are all just kind of quick notes as we complete a week, and then we can go back and look at them 6 months from now or whatever and get a sense of what was going on. So this is the lab summary for 2020. Link to that. So we have all these things, and I go back often to this archive to see what was happening like 4 months ago because I can't remember. And so it's surprising sometimes what we've already covered. I just want to make sure that we don't cover things twice or whatever. So that's a good resource for that. We also have a couple of our other projects here. We have the MetaBrain models, we have developmental AI, we have the COG study. So this is actually maybe relevant to the Trajectories endeavor. So this is, again, kind of the landing page for COG study. This is a journal club and salon. So this is sort of like, some of the stuff that Jesse was doing last fall on the Nunez paper. It's some other direction or some other papers for discussion. So these are all kind of like, things that, touchstone references, maybe we could call them, where you have things that, if you want to start, starting place for understanding things about cognitive science, sort of the meta science of cognitive science, then here's some places to look. So I know we talked about what happened to cognitive science, there's what happened to cybernetics, and so forth.
Would you want to basically invite people, this is kind of a throwback to stuff I thought about just now, or like visited now and updating the website. Do you think we should invite people to our Slack to have them? Like, hey, join our Slack discussion. Or how do you want to do that?
Yeah, we could do that. I mean, I think that would be a good place. I know, like, Slack only allows for 10,000 messages, so I don't know if there's and there's no good way to archive the channels. Nevertheless, it is a good centralized place to do it. I would invite people to the Slack. I don't think we're going to get like massive numbers of people, so we'll just invite people to the Slack. I have a Launchpass link. I don't know if you have it, but it's in the. I can provide it to you if we put it on there.
I have a Discord server that could be used too, but I'm sort of leaning towards Slack just because I don't think it's going to be. I think it's more kind of an option. If someone's particularly enthusiastic about it, they could reach out. I don't think people are going to really. There's going to be like 200 people.
Yeah.
Jamming into Slack.
Yeah, I think we already have a discussion tempo established in Slack on this topic, so I think that would be a good place to bring people, onboard people into. So we'll get that together. Let me go sharing my screen. Okay, so yeah, there we go. And then this is the GitHub organization, and then of course we have the NeuroMatch. So NeuroMatch Academy is starting soon. I still haven't heard anything back about the mentor. I don't know if they're just going to assign us to groups or what, but I know that they've been prepping, and it's either this coming week or the following week when the computational neuroscience series starts. So there we have this NeuroMatch repository, and this is we actually have one at the old legacy organization repo, which is the stuff that we were doing last year, but this is sort of a summary of all that. So For Academy 2020, we don't really have anything in there, although there's stuff at the legacy repo, and I'll need to update this. Academy 2021, again, there's nothing really to report on that yet. But speaking of this, I am taking, we did have this website page, and this is on the Representational Brains and Phenotypes website, which is a project under the lab. It has its own website. So this is the group here. This is largely all the agent stuff. So this is like the CGS agents, the developmental brain vehicles agents. So anything agent based is in this group, and I have like a website for it. We have different interest groups here, and then there's this set of education tabs. So there's Google Summer of Code, which we've done the Saturday or group Saturday morning, NeuroSim, Brains, Behavior, and Complexity curriculum. This is the thing I wanted to show you. So this is one of the educational initiatives, and this is like if you're wanting to learn, some of the concepts that we talk about in the meetings, and you want to get a better handle on some of these ideas, then I'm putting together this list of resources, and of course it includes Neuromatch Academy. So this website was for the pre-course that we planned last year that we had some interest in, but they've done a formal pre-course in Neuromatch Academy this year. And aside from that, I wasn't really sure that we had wanted to do that again. I don't have time for it, but I think this is like transferring that sort of energy to this new thing, which is, I think, going to be useful for people. So this kind of ties into Jesse's Summer of Data in a way, although we need to bolster the data science component of this. I need to finish it up too. There's some missing stuff in here. But so the idea is to introduce people to different sets of curriculum. So there's this Neuromatch Academy. I didn't put a title on this, but this is Complexity Explorer, which is run by the Santa Fe Institute. So they have a number of tutorials and courses on differential equations, information theory, agent-based models, and game theory. There are probably some data science stuff that we need to put in here as well. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to edit some of these headings and things. And so there are a couple of activities that people can participate in. There's this stuff from the Neuromatch pre-course where people can create little examples and collab notebooks of what they've learned. They can create explainer videos, and so those are explained here. And then these resources, which we have tables for. So this first one is general resources. These are like general, very high-level reviews of different topics. It's like fundamentals of neuroscience. Some things for doing open science, like version control and markdown, and then like some very basic Python, some basic statistical thinking. So those are all in here. And I need to curate this a little bit better. And then there's this DVORM ML course lecture list, which is, again, this course that we did in 2019 through the DVORM group, and it's just a series of topics in machine learning. And so those are there. And then we have these other things, and these were lectures that we did last summer in the group here. So there was the NetLogo tutorial. There was a larger agent-based modeling lecture. There was aging, development, and life history. There was Bayesian thinking, models and systems. There was critical periods. There was flock swarms and collective behavior. And then there was information theory. And all those are available here in the slides. I was thinking of a couple other ones we could do maybe this summer. One is, of course, genetic algorithms, which we just talked about. Another is network science. And then a very high-level sort of introduction. And these lectures, in case I know Angela wasn't here, but Jesse was. If you recall last summer, these resources aren't like a typical lecture on these things. They're kind of specialized in a certain way. Like, they're presented in a way that's a little bit more exploratory, for students to get like interested in different areas of you know, applications to these ideas. You know, you could get a straightforward information theory treatment, for example, but you know, this lecture, it wasn't just that. There were some other things that we considered as well. So there's a special, you know, there's a sort of special sort of curricular aspect to it that is unique to the lab. So those are all the resources. And so that's what I'm thinking for this, is that, you know, we put together this set of resources so people can get up to speed on different things, lay out the resources. And of course, the NeuroMatch Academy is totally open, so you can just go to the syllabus and look at the videos, and you don't have to enroll. You can do the observer track, and then you can, you know, if you need refreshers on all of that, you can go to some of the pre-course materials that they have. So the idea is that you have all these concepts that get talked about in the meetings. You go to this resource, you can go to any one of these different sets of resources that are already pre-made, tutorials, courses, go through the materials, and then if you don't understand that, then you can go to some of the other preparatory materials or some of the larger, higher level tutorials, and hopefully you can sort of wrestle these topics, maybe on your own, maybe in small groups. So I don't know if anyone had any thoughts about that.
Could you say the last part again? I didn't quite hear the last like sentence or so.
Oh, so the idea is to get people, the agency, to research, like if you hear about topics in the meeting or even like somewhere else in the world, you can go to that list of tutorials and you can, you know, basically trace down the thing you don't understand. So it's like a fault trace where you have, like, you say, I don't understand this concept, and then you go to these resources like NeuroMatch or Complexity Explorer, and you do a tutorial, and then if you don't understand that, then there are other things that you can go to that, you know, allow you to get to the point where you don't understand it. I mean, that's the ultimate goal here.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, so I don't know how we'll update it. I'll try to work on it some more and get it in shape, and you know, and then we'll have this resource for people. I don't know what the situation is going to be like with NeuroMatch this year. Who's going to be, like, I'll probably be mentoring some people. We have some people in the group who are doing it. Both, of course, there's now the deep learning course, so I don't know what that's going to look like. This is the first year they've done it, so hopefully we can, there's some residual from that as well. But, okay. So, did either Jesse or Angela want to give an update on anything they're working on?
I have been mostly working on my own business, so I have like I'm actually reading this cool book called Lifespan. Nothing to do with my business, by the way. Lifespan, about anti-aging, and it's really interesting. It's not really like super relevant to what we're talking about here, but it's at least more relevant than whatever I'm doing. So that's my update.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, glad you're enjoying that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. It's like mind-blowing.
Is it about, like, people working on, like, anti-aging, like, cures, or, like, I don't want to say cures, but, like, anti-aging science, or what is the...
Yeah. All of the above, the information theory of like why aging occurs and stuff. So it's the person, I think David Sinclair is his name. He's writing about that theory and the ways forward for it. And it's making me believe some pretty sci-fi ideas. I'm excited.
Do you like have any opinions about that? We went the Envision where Ray was there, and he was talking about his stuff. Do you think it was anything compared to that similar, or?
Similar, but they have fundamentally different theories, but I don't even remember what Aubrey de Grey's theory. Like, I remember it was actually the one I remember the most of the presentations is a super complicated diagram. You remember where like everything's pointing to everything else,
and kind of, yeah. And it was I remember him being like he was this really particular look that he had, and he was very cavalier about why it was stupid to not be like 100% gung-ho about longevity and stuff like that. So.
Ironically, I kind of agree with him on like philosophical grounds, which is funny because I'm not actually working on Antiaging. Yeah, I mean, hey, we could do an aging portion of this lab.
There's been interest in it before. Who was this? Was it Suniti?
Yeah.
Or I think it was. I think she's not quite active right now, but I mean, there's definitely, especially with like overlaps into the biology stuff. They're like open or Devo worm and stuff. Like there's, I'm sure Dick and company would have things to say about that. So I mean, there's a way to there could be a potential branch for that if people have enough interest in it and want to do it.
Yeah, actually, if that is the case, and we do have an anti-aging segment, I have a friend over who just quit his PhD in aging, and I think he would be interested in joining the Recombination lab.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, we did have that lecture that I showed a preview of here. It was this one here, the aging, development, and life history. So there is that interest. We had last summer. We had a couple people who were interested in that topic, and of course, Neuromatch combines neuroscience and computational stuff. So the neuroscience part actually was the more challenging part because we had to we had to get people up to speed on that. Where a lot of people were thinking about neural networks, and this is much different than that. So, yeah, let's talk about that some more. I don't know. I mean, we did talk a little bit about it last summer, and we've actually, I think also Anusha is interested in neurobiology and some aspects of that. So, I mean, aging is sort of has connections to development. So, and we should pick up on that theme in the future.
Okay. As far as my updates go, it's well. I guess what I would say is I'm working on the website now and sorting some of that out. I didn't do anything substantial since last week, so I've kind of been caught up in some other things. That said, if there's anything that I could do for the lab at Oxford University or in London, I will be there in 2 weeks. I'm kind of going as a Oxford's slightly business oriented, but also I'm going to be meeting that fellow. Someone from Oxford is, I keep forgetting his name. Alexander, I think. Really, he's a popular guy through Neuromatch. He's a neuroscientist guy. He's a really nice guy, and I might meet him there. Also, I might meet Charlotte in London as well. Charlotte Guo, who we did a collaboration with in December, I think. The Philosophers Web Cafe.
Yeah.
And some other friends who were in the area too. So I mean, that's kind of arranging a lot of that actually ate up a lot of my bandwidth this week, just because I've never been to London or Oxford. It's quite weird because I I'm as sort of a personal note, like I'm so split between, and I don't know. I just heard from Erin. She may be here or not. Um, I'm not sure. Um, it's weird because I'm completely living in Eastern time, and I'm in the UK, which is plus 5 hours ahead.
Right.
And like, when I go to London and Oxford, especially because there'll be so much more interaction with those places, it's going to be a little bit weird. But it's also like it's been really. I can't say I would advise people to just travel and visit the UK right now. Honestly, like I would kind of advise against it just because things are rising and whatever else. But I'm glad to be here while I am here, and I'm like also like really close to closing on a place in Boston, which is kind of my ultimate goal of to like moving to Boston, which would be a whole lot of opportunities for the lab and for a lot of other things as well, as opposed to previous places that I've lived, and no, nothing against those places for sure, but my future has been in Boston, or at least someplace like that for a while. So I'm kind of I've been in this phase of my life for about 3 weeks where it's like, well, I'm not really in Albany, New York anymore, and I'm now in the UK for a bit, and then it's like finding another place to be, and then like I can't. It's really hard for me to fathom right now what not changing my location in 2 to 6 weeks feels like, because I don't know what that is. So that's a bit of a personal update, but it's a very interesting time, a time of like riding the winds and seeing where they fall somewhat. But I'm very happy to be doing what we're doing in the lab, and I know I haven't had my fullest intentions for some things, but I think I'm very happy to be here and doing what we're doing. And I really it's a little bit scary because it's like, to me the end of July is like here now. Like I'm thinking, oh my god, I have all this stuff to sort out for the Kuchin future stuff, and even like I feel bad because the ethics team, and it's in part, we've all had things to do, but like the ethics team needs a little bit more structure, and if things stay steady over the next week, I'm hoping to really iron out some of those things. As far as like actual other updates, Anson, he is here on the UK as well. Just if anybody who doesn't really know, we're both in the UK at a research grant of sorts, and Anson has settled a bit. They're not really able to join right now, but they're starting to settle into their I don't know how to refer to it, but their academic mindset. It's just really interesting environment here. Maybe I should just give an update about that. We're at a effective altruism sort of sanctioned or funded situation here, and it's been interesting to have. The main benefit of the program is that a bunch of people of similar. It's kind of like a pseudo envision, but not really. Like there's no. It's more like just that environment of people who are here talking about interesting stuff, and there was really interesting discussions about artificial intelligence safety, artificial intelligence ethics, and even like adjacent ethics to it as well. But and some sort of personal projects involved with it, I don't want to speak for them too much, but kind of he was excited yesterday thinking about how there was some offshoot of a conversation we've had here with some of our, I don't know, colleagues, I suppose, and there was a discussion of like different, this is a bit putting words together between Anson and other people's ideas here, but Anson took it as like putting some structure, even like geometric structure, to economies of interaction. And I thought a little bit about contextual geometric structures, as we talked about in lab before, and also like as a way of Anson still interested in allostasis and regulation and like the social dynamics and people's like inner worlds and archetypes, and sort of how these sort of economies of interpersonal relations, you might say. And he was quite excited about that, and I think he even started sketching out some more things in that again, which is a really good sign, because that's you know, it's been I've been talking quite about my life transitions, and in some ways Anson's are much more robust and there's a lot going on for him as well. And when he comes back, he can talk about them as he chooses. But it's nice to see him settling in here, and after the quarantine finally ended for him, and so that's kind of what's up with that, and I think there's a lot of potential to, you know, I'm sure everybody gets this with Angela and her doing your own business stuff and general entrepreneurial whatever, and Bradly managing all sorts of things. But it's like there's sort of this space of development where you know that as a project manager or whatever, you can apply some structure to it and push it in a direction, and that's good. And then it's like a mix between that and just waiting for things to ripen. As it like, all right, like it needs a little bit more time, and it'll be there. And so I feel like with everything in a lab, I'm kind of in that limbo.
Jesse, I think you froze up. He did freeze up. Okay. I don't know if he's going to disconnect and reconnect, but...
You can do it, Jesse! You can do it!
Well, I think, yeah, that's a good... I don't know if you can hear me, Jesse, but... yeah, I think that's good. I'm glad to hear that Anson's drawing again. I was very impressed with his sketches. I think they're very... they take things in interesting directions. And, you know, sketching things out is always really good to sort of get a handle on ideas. But, yeah, I think that's great. Especially some of the stuff he's been doing with allostasis and some of the other things you've been telling me about. And we should revisit contextual geometric structures with respect to this too. Oh, there he is. You're back, Jesse.
Yeah, what did I miss there?
Well, I was just getting into kind of my thoughts about. I'm glad to hear that Anson is doing his sketching again, because that's a way. It seems to be a strength of his to get his ideas out through the sketches and through figures. It's always very valuable. There we go. Yeah, and then I'm interested in hearing about, well, we should revisit contextual geometric structures, but also with respect to allostasis and all this. So I think that's going to be kind of an interesting path forward.
Yeah, kind of like the main point of what I was saying is basically, I think I'm very happy that Anson's here. I think if we give him time and the right stuff, like I think he's going to make a lot of. He's going to be here for basically 6 months, and I won't be here that long. But I'm really sort of like I'm really excited because I think if he just has time to like dealing with his own health stuff and his own whatever everything else, I think there's going to be some really interesting fruit that's produced here, so to say. So that's going well. I can report that everybody's in good spirits here. I had a little bit of a, I guess, health issue myself this week, but I'm better now. We'll both be going to Oxford, hopefully. We'll both be going to London for a little bit. And if there's anybody else that we meet or talk to in London or Oxford, let us know. Or anything like. I know. I mean, I'm kind of referring to this in general, but like I know because I'm the line manager, blah blah blah. But like, if there's anything that you'd like me to like promote or give attention to my travels, and kind of like being Mr. Frontman for some reason right now anyway. So let me know about that. But I'm that'll be exciting, and I think that's pretty much it. The only thing I would say is I may be going to several, and this is kind of my weekly allusion to future stuff about AR, VR, biometrics, and so on. But I may be going to like some conferences and events along those lines in the future as well. So keep it in the back of your mind. We have so many things to do right now, but like in the back of your mind, like I don't think it would tie into longevity directly, but just there's definitely going to be something about the collection and interpretation of biometric data, but also just ways that agents perceive things in digital worlds, or like the interface between digital worlds and human. That measurement between human and machine in a digital sense, and the collection data. There's going to be like there's going to be stuff happening about that. Might even be next year at this point, but just like continue to just note that. So that's pretty much all of my major updates for the time being. Does anybody have any questions for me? I know I said a lot of weird stuff.
Angela, do you have anything?
No.
Anything you want me to come back and answer?
Well, yeah, I think the last part is interesting. I was gonna actually get something together for today on virtual worlds, AR, VR, but I couldn't get it together, so I don't know. But that we'll be talking definitely in the next several weeks. We'll be talking about that. In terms of Anson, I just wish him well. I hope he's doing well there. He's welcome to join the meetings anytime or participate on the Slack. I'm looking forward to seeing what his experience brings in terms of getting him, help bolstering his development. I think that'll be a good opportunity for him. And I think, in terms of like promoting things in the UK, if you see people, let them know that we exist and, they're welcome to join in. And I don't, they don't really have a plan for it, but it's kind of one of those things like you meet people, if they're excited about it, it might lead to something. Most people probably won't be excited about it or, but it's something that you just have to it's not for everyone, and it's not something that everyone's going to think it's like the greatest thing ever, but, still, you might get people who are collaborators.
Yeah. There was actually something else that came up. It was an interesting way to think about. I was just reminded of something that came up in a discussion, I think yesterday or the day before, and it was about being multidisciplinary, and or like the term generalist, and I have to imagine that Angela immediately thinks Andrew Sandberg from Envision because of all this stuff. Every year maybe they're talking about generalist stuff or whatever else. So I mentioned that, and Anson would be here, would think that as well. But the discussion was actually in the context of effective altruism and also like some elements of existential risk and that stuff. And I think what I want to say in this moment is it was really interesting to hear a perspective about how some elements of effective altruism and existential risk, which is kind of a small community as it is, but like they're starting to kind of get savvy to the idea that yes, we need people to be interdisciplinary and generalist and caring about like existential risk too. And that was kind of nice because sometimes like parts of like hyper-rationalist community or effective altruism or existential risk they can be a little bit ironically non-integrative with their views. So it was really cool to hear this sort of profession of, hey, we need to promote interdisciplinary people coming and caring about this stuff and being open to it. And I think, I'm not saying, I'm pretty sure, like, Orthogonal Lab isn't going to be going, hey, we're going to have an extra skill now. No, much more like thinking about the ways of, like, it was just an interesting way to think about messaging, and you know, I know Bradley was saying, oh, that's not for everybody, and that's true. But I think we can also, I think some of our most accessible things in the lab, and forgive me because I'm like deep in marketing and communications and network and strategic initiatives speaking mindset. But I think some of the most important things that we are doing that apply pretty much to everybody are about open source, open data, open science, and I really, a lot of people that I do bring to the lab really like that, and like Erin would really be like, I don't think she's going to be able to make it today, but that push towards accessibility, and there's a lot of push about this. And on a related, extra related note, an extra tangent, Angela may know, but Bradley may know. Distill.pub is kind of that actually is taking a hiatus. They're stopping for a while, and that's kind of a big. I didn't fully get to read their blog post about why they're doing that, but I know it has to do with like some kind of some. They're kind of wondering what's the best thing for them to be doing. Should people be publishing differently and so on? And I just feel like these are really important. These are really interesting things to be thinking of, and how what we're doing with our efforts fit into these broader challenges of publishing and access and data and all this other stuff. So that's a couple of tangents. But the main point was I think we're in a really interesting stuff. And I know this is Angela as well, kind of specifically, which is good that you're here for this. But like, I think there's a very specific like. I think it's a really interesting moment for how people talk about being interdisciplinary, and how people talk about pushing information forward. I think about like make truth matter again, plug for them too. But like how we're conveying, trying to do research in the moment that we're in is a really interesting thing to do. And as you guys know, I'm doing stuff with State of the AI, which is an open source attempt at classifying or mapping out a lot of trajectories in like computer science research. But I think it's just a really. I think sometimes it gets lost in what we're doing, or like in some of the communications, and I feel a little bit lab manager responsibility that I'm not pushing out some more stuff for the lab. But I think it's something really interesting and special that we can highlight on what we're doing. Because I think it's a really interesting point of interface with the scientific community and the world in general. So yeah. That's my last thing to say. But, it was cool. A lot of obviously, as you can tell, I didn't really have some of those thoughts planned, but they were things I was thinking about a lot this week from the discussions that I've been here. And maybe that's something that NC can do in the future, just kind of talk about a little bit about what the discussions here, because it's very much like envision. You just have to into these conversations, and then you can derive a lot of things from it later on. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think those are a lot of good points, especially the part about sort of playing up the interdisciplinary aspect of it, and kind of selling that as its own component. You know, like a lot of labs are sort of like topical. They, explore some topical area. I guess people do explore interdisciplinarity in some way, usually from a meta-scientific standpoint. But they don't really kind of get into the lived experience, which is kind of what we do. Also, we don't really get into thinking about that in terms of a research topic. So, like the lived experience in terms of a research topic would be like, how do you go about organizing an open interdisciplinary project? What is involved in that? And sort of Trajectories is sort of like that, because you're kind of thinking about taking apart a field or some area of inquiry. Oh, Jesse dropped off. And then kind of reassembling it. Okay. I don't know why. Okay, there we go. Jesse, you back?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, so people don't think of it in terms of in terms of the trajectories thing, as I was saying, it's like you take this field, you sort of assess its, state critically, and then you kind of figure out, what the sort of the ingredients of that are. So, there's that aspect of it in the Trajectories work too. But, yeah, I think that's definitely a selling point, is the interdisciplinarity part. So, definitely. I didn't mean to say that it's not, when I say it's not for everyone, I didn't mean to say we shouldn't try to knock on doors if that's something that, if there are groups of people who are, like, friendly to the cause, that we shouldn't sort of evangelize. But definitely, there are certain, sometimes people aren't really interested in interdisciplinarity. They think it's kind of obvious or a waste of time. So just letting you know that, like, that's not a point of view that's shared by everyone.
Yeah. Also, I was going to say, I may have especially when I get down to Boston, I'm kind of going to try to do, like, I wish I had them ready now. Like, I kind of have like a shirt. Like, I'm gonna try to get a shirt made, just like one brand advertisement for state of the AI. And I want to go into the lab too. And I think I know how I'm going to do it. So I don't know. This is like kind of a fun side thing, but if anybody wants, I think I'm gonna. I don't know if anyone knows the site redbubble.com. It's like a place to get. You can make custom shirts, stickers, and everything else. And because how I have to like page generic for it, but I don't really care. So if there's a particular like logo you'd like to have on a t-shirt, let me know. This is not the most serious thing, but I kind of love the idea of having like a lab t-shirt, representing the time. So.
Right.
So that's my final remark to that. Or like, they can also do like little buttons, like no button, or like silly things like that. I'm probably gonna, in my infinite time that is just falling out for me. But I mean, if there's a logo, I think pretty much set on colors, like The lab color is like the blue thing, and then the logo is sort of that multiple door box stuff. But everything else that you want to be kind of put in the sense, and I'm just thinking about Bradly right now. So like, if it's just something to think about. If you're like, no, don't do that, that's fine too.
Oh no, that would be great. I toyed with the idea of swag before. I didn't know how to do it though. I mean, I didn't really think through too deeply on how to do it. So we should do that.
It may be just be my personal vanity as like a vain nerd, but like walking around London or Boston in like a blazer with a shirt on that's like, here's my lab shirt. That's just like feels like next level like nerd vanity swag, and I'm really here for it. So that's just something that I want to do, and I'll be happy to like. Honestly, I wouldn't mind. Like I could get a shirt for like Hanson and NeuroSim stuff too. So like you know, and Angela, but you know, if you want a shirt, you can have it.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Like you know, we could all meet up one day where I get like God tier nerds who would be appreciated. That's like I haven't really. As the last personal note for all this, like, I don't think I've really seemed very excited about anything that I'm doing lately, or like that I'm like these different places, and that's in part just because my mind is fully in like all these logistics about sorting all the things that are coming up ahead. But yeah, I'm very excited to be here, and I'm really hopefully things are going well with everything that I'm doing, and like it will be great to kind of be able to go to some things. Like I haven't met Bradly in person ever. We're going to meet at CSV, right? And then like COVID happened, and everything else happened a year. So it is kind of a goal to meet. I've obviously Anson's here, and I've met Angela before, but even like Erin, maybe Erin. Let's all have thoughts and wishes for her because she may be getting a really cool opportunity soon. That's kind of what she's busy with. But you know, I kind of in my the world isn't on fire and pandemic like version of the future, which it's really popular here to say non-zero. Like that's not there's non-zero likelihood that would happen. It's like it's non-zero, I guess, but it's still not very. You know, I'm still not holding my breath about the fact that I could just go around and see people, you know, in the future. So, like at some event or a conference that I'll go to back in like normal times, you know, look forward to that. Just kind of make, even just thinking that that's a possibility in the future is kind of a fun thing to think about. So that's it. That's all I got.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah, one of my old labs, we had T-shirts. I still have one of them. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, but there was that sort of like, you know, vanity aspect of it. But it's always good, like if you go to conferences, just to have it there, you know, like.
Yeah. Like especially like what's you know, I'm part of the appeal of moving to Boston is like it's just. I think it's almost expected there that you just get it. Where like if I were in Albany, you know, or other places like, But like, you have a nerd shirt on. Let me ask you about that. That kind of, you know, that'll happen there. So yeah. Please, like take a picture of that or something, or just like I don't know if it's still available, but I'm curious what designs were in the past. And
oh yeah, I'll have to take a picture of it and put it on Slack. So yeah. Yeah, I think the point was at one time they were trying to really push the lab at conferences, and you know the physical conference, of course, is that's always a cost, to get things there, and but like virtually, there might be, you can wear a shirt on camera. It's not, but also like having like virtual swag. I don't know what that would look like. Could be anything from like a virtual world to something else.
There's like we could do like some custom backgrounds. That's the thing. But it just reminded me. This is totally just self-absorption to the max. I haven't gotten any swag for any conferences at all. Like I missed the opportunity to get the ACM neurospatial limited computing. Everyone tried to get one for Erin because she was coming to do stuff too. We both missed out on that. And again, computer vision. And it's just like, I gotta get my fix. So I'm probably just gonna make a t-shirt for lab myself and then maybe sell it to State of AI. As soon as I possibly can. I think I actually got like a mug and a t-shirt from my new job at all things sent to me, and I haven't gotten it yet because I'm not home.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, but now like nerd swag. So that'll be my Carthago, the one that asked after how to say it. I Carthago or Carthago was my speech today.
Yeah, we should look into that. So yeah, I'll talk about that more in the coming weeks.
Not important, but I'll probably do it anyway.
Yeah. So yeah, that's great. And then I just mentioned the virtual thing. It reminds me of that. Like, I don't know what we can do in like the virtual world. I know like in years past they've had things like Spaces in Second Life and things where you design like a virtual space, like logos and things on it. But I don't know what the equivalent of that would be today.
Did we say that we're looking at September for the data privacy mini conference thing?
Oh yeah, that was the tentative date. I think September, like sometime in fall. I wanted to wait until summer was over to get people.
Okay.
Yeah, but we'll see what the exact date will be. Okay. Yeah, so that's good. And then so I guess we'll move on to. I had a couple of things. I want to do some papers, but I also want to talk a little bit about our submissions document. So, again, I think we're caught up on a lot of it. There's some of it that, like the cognitive offloading, that's still in progress. Some things that are still out, but mostly I think we're caught up. Then we have the developmental model of intelligence offloading. So we have, I've added more slides since last time. So there are like things in here, like the Andy Clark example from one of his books on the bluefin dolphin. So this is using vortices in the environment to improve swimming capacity. And then kind of putting that in a developmental context, which that still needs to be done here. Maybe we'll add a new slide for that. And then the intelligence offloading, so why development, and then we kind of describe why that is. Some developmental systems theory, the zone of proximal development, which is still going, it's still being worked on, and the basic model of the agent with different trade-offs, internal representations, and then we have a bunch of different citations here that are highlighted. So, Hi, Erin. How are you?
We'll be able to do chat.
Okay, that's okay.
Glad you could stop by, Erin.
Yeah, glad you could make it, Erin. So, as going through this talk, the developmental model of intelligence offloading. So then we set a couple papers in here, kind of rooted into this idea. So we have these developmental trade-offs here of the agent, why internal representations. Maybe that should go above this, but like at really, one area where Jesse and Angela could help is to sort of figure out what order these should be in, what order would be better, and so forth. And then some things about different things about brain growth and how these things work with respect to social interaction and lifespan, life history, and then talking a little bit about something called heterochrony, which is where the brain and the body grow at different rates in development and how those relate to offloading. And then there's sequence heterochrony, which is where different things get put in place at different times. Maybe there need to be some more visualizations of what those look like concretely. and then the example of spatial cognition, which is the final example in this talk. So I don't know exactly what that'll look like. Maybe some things on mental rotation, but there is definitely something that we could talk about there as a concrete example of how this might happen. So this is supposed to, I think we're bumping up against the capacity of this talk. It's supposed to be 12 minutes. So again, it's going to be one of those things that, oh, thank you. Minimal model of the role of social interaction and neural complexity. Yeah, thank you. So we'll have to, like, some of the things might have to be trimmed down or modified a bit, but that's the way these things work with 12 minutes. And a lot of it will probably be, we'll be pushing through it. The idea of one of these talks is to give people a taste of things and then get them interested in the topic. And then if they have more questions, they can come to us and we can talk about it more. It's a sort of a lure into our world of thinking. So the event itself, I don't have the link to the agenda. They have the agenda up now, but it looks like it's going to be a pretty good event. A lot of talks on different topics. So maybe next week we'll go over that in more detail. So let's see. Now I want to get into the papers since we're probably at a good time for this. So, I've been collecting papers as we go along here, and a lot of them get pushed to the next week, and so it's good to have a little bit more time for that. So the first thing I want to talk about is conceptual blending, and especially with respect to machine learning. So I know we've talked about conceptual blending before, and this is actually something related to the contextual geometric structures work, because the idea there is that you're kind of putting together concepts into a common framework. There's blending of concepts over time. There is this idea of conceptual blending, and this actually started out in cognitive linguistics. And Falconier and Turner, they were the original authors of this idea. They called it conceptual integration or view application, conceptual blending. Those are the alternate terms for it. It's a theory of cognition. According to this theory, elements and vital relations from diverse scenarios are blended in a subconscious process, which is assumed to be ubiquitous to everyday thought and language. Much like memetics, it is an attempt to create a unitary account of the cultural transmission of ideas. So their idea, they're very much interested in cultural evolution and this idea of subconscious blending. And so one of the inspirations for the contextual geometric structures idea is the subconscious blending. If you read Pierre Bourdieu, who we talked about last week, his idea of practice and what he calls the habitus relies on these subconscious processes that generate cultural behaviors, cultural diversity. So, it's very interesting to think of this as a subconscious process because, you think of culture maybe as conscious or intentional, but a lot of what we learn in terms of culture, in terms of like a cultural tradition is subconscious. You engage in a ritual, you don't think about every aspect of the ritual and break it down and deconstruct it. You kind of adopt the whole thing, in its entirety. And same thing with cultural practices. You don't think about using a fork and knife, or you don't think about using chopsticks. I mean, if you're if you're going to a restaurant and you use them on a special occasion, you might think about it. But if that's what you grow up using to eat, then that's what you do, and you don't think about too much about the alternatives or about how you might use them in an alternate fashion, or people will deconstruct things, but it's generally a separate exercise that comes from your experience. But then you can think of why that would be important, because you want to give people cultural information without them kind of reinventing the wheel. So you can pass on large units of information, here's this technology, how to use the internet. We don't think about most people don't think about the underpinnings of the internet and how they can modify it. They just kind of learn how to use the internet, and then that's part of their cultural practice of using the internet. But that's sort of the idea. It's like this large unit of cultural inheritance, and then it's subconscious in its execution. So they started this theory in the 90s, and it was and a representative early formation is found in the online article Conceptual Integration and Formal Expression, which is this link here. Turner and Falconier cite Arthur Koestler's 1964 book, The Act of Creation, as an early forerunner of conceptual blending. Koestler had identified a common pattern in creative achievements in the arts, sciences, and humor that he had termed bisociation of matrices. So I don't know. I'm not familiar with that idea specifically, but a newer version of blending theory with somewhat different terminology was presented in Turner and Falconier's 2002 book, The Way We Think. Conceptual blending is one of the theoretical tools used in George Lakoff and Rafael Nunez, is where mathematics comes from. So there's Rafael Nunez. He's in this mix with George Lakoff. So this is where the authors assert that understanding mathematics requires the mastering of extensive networks of metaphorical blends. And so these are blended metaphors from different sources, and they kind of come together. And again, you don't think about that when you practice it, right? You do mathematics, and you don't really think about the underlying metaphors. I mean, people do this as an exercise of deconstruction, but they don't do it when they're actually going through the process. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but that's kind of the idea here. And so conceptual blending is closely related to frame-based theories, which are like the idea that you come to things in a certain frame of reference. Like, if I do something, there's a context in which I do it. There's a frame of reference in which I see the world. So I can't see the world from someone else's perspective automatically. I have to take some effort to do that. But this goes beyond that in the sense that this allows you to combine frames or frames of reference and blend them together. So the idea is that people are doing things in different ways, and then they kind of they get blended together, and then you adopt that blend, where there are two frames of reference that are sort of blended together, and you don't really question it. So, the evolution of a lot of things in science or maybe in religion have that quality where you get blended things that kind of come together, and they're incongruent in some ways, but they don't automatically get resolved. You don't automatically say, well, that's just, that's inconsistent. You kind of adopt that inconsistency. Some later models are based on structure mapping, which did not exist at the time of the earlier implementation. So this is where they're applying it to computational models. There's an early computational model, which I guess would be in the 90s or something, or 80s, called view application. This is something that's very similar to conceptual blending. So you can see that there's a lot of like background to this, and people have kind of approached this in different ways. So this is actually the Wikipedia article, but then there's this other article that has that is actually something from CogSci 2021. So they're going to be at CogSci 2021, and in fact, I think it's one of the discussion groups that's competing with us, or they're at another time. They're in that time point though, in that same group of presentations. So it's called Conceptual Blending in Animal Cognition, a Comparative Approach. This is they call it a symposium. And it's not going to be in Vienna, it's going to be online. But we bring together a diverse group of researchers to discuss human unique cognitive abilities through the lens of conceptual blending theory. Turner introduces this theory and outlines the cross-species Klein of conceptual blending. So now we're talking about going cross-species, not just in humans, but now animal concepts and how they blend. And so this is they're arguing now that this isn't just something that occurs in humans, it occurs across species. Pelkey provides evidence for various types of blends in bats and discusses the conclusions of these analyses. Leonardus, Semenux, and Coulson emphasize the importance of taking non-human perspectives and analyzing behaviors with this theory. And Adachi discusses work on metaphor on cross-modal mappings in primates. Forster serves as the moderator. So these last names are people involved in this session. And it looks like Mark Turner runs something called the Red Hen Lab, which is a lab that is, I think they're on YouTube, and they do a lot of work with blending. I think they're run out of Case Western University in Cleveland in the U.S. So they have this thing called the riddle of the Buddhist monk. A Buddhist monk begins at dawn one day walking up a mountain, reaches the top at sunset, meditates on the top of the hill overnight, until at dawn he begins to walk back to the foot of the mountains. So this is the monk going up the mountain and back. Make no assumptions about his starting or stopping, about his pace during the trips. And the riddle is there a place on the path that the monk occupies at the same hour of day on the 2 trips? And you have to click there for the full answer. And so I don't really know I don't know if this refers to like sort of the concept of the blend, or I guess it is, because the idea is that you're blending time and you're blending this path, and you're kind of like, what is the sort of category for it? So like this relates to CGS in that we talk about like, treating categories in fundamentally different ways from like the conventional way that it's done in machine learning and in AI, where you have these classical sets and you're trying to optimize for single like identifications of things in the world. Instead, you're operating on like the sensory world, and then you're mapping it to a concept space which doesn't behave like a classical set. It has these properties of soft classification, which has allows for intransitivity and other things. So these are some references here on this topic, and so these range from like the arts to children's play to film, human mathematics, and then some things in early Christian discourse, and there's some more on how compression gives rise to metaphor and metonymy. This is, I don't know what compression is, but that's a technical term in the field. Then there are other things, there are other kind of more conceptual and theoretical resources here. So, Symposium on Narrative Blending in Scientific Communication. I think that has to do with a lot of the stuff that has been advocated by, what's his name? The linguist we were just talking about. Well, anyways, there's this stuff about like how to best approach scientific communication in terms of categorization, in terms of describing things to people, the kind of language that you use. So that's those resources. And then finally, there's this paper, and maybe I set that up too much, but there's this paper on this, how they're doing this in machine learning. So it's called, there's this paper, and there are other papers on this, and I think we actually did talk about this in a previous meeting, but I didn't really give the background on it then. It's called Visual Conceptual Blending with Large-Scale Language and Vision Models. So this is the abstract here, and this is off the archive. It's like a conference paper. We asked the question, to what extent can recent large-scale language and image generation models blend visual concepts? So given an arbitrary object, we identify a relevant object and generate a single sentence description of the blend of the two things using a language model. So we then generate a visual depiction of the blend using a text-based image generation model. So they're kind of solving this problem in a way that's a little bit different than how we might think of it in terms of like human behavior or animal behavior. Quantitative and qualitative evaluations demonstrate the superiority of language models over classical methods for conceptual blending, and of recent large-scale image generation models over prior models for the visual depiction. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to blend visual and text representations into these blended concepts. And so here's an example: a tree made of blue and red blood vessels. And yet, so we have the circulatory system, which is like tree-like, and then you incorporate that into a tree that you might see out in a field somewhere. You might see a tree that has leaves, and this is a tree-like structure. So you're blending the two. You're taking the linguistic definition of a tree, which is what we use to describe the network of blood vessels, but you're also taking a tree, which we also use to describe a large plant. And so we can merge those two into a single concept. And then a second example is the moon that is sliced like an orange. So a moon is round, and sometimes it's orangish. And then you also have an orange, which is orangish and round. And so you can merge those two. You can treat the moon as this thing that you can slice like an orange. And so you can think about, especially like in development, when you think about children learning the concept, sometimes, they might think, well, you have, and, the moon looks like an orange in the sky, and, there's this whole thing where you might reason that you could grab the moon and it's, you could slice it and open it up and it would look like an orange, or the old adage that the moon is made of green cheese is similar, where you just kind of don't really understand what you're looking at, the internal mechanics, so you make these sort of blend these concepts together and use that as an explanatory framework. So it's definitely something that we know happens in humans, but the question is, can we use machine intelligence to sort of simulate this or to build these kind of representations? And so they're using deep neural networks to do this. They're using language models and visual models, state-of-the-art models to do this. So many systems developed by these studies act as support tools for augmenting human creativity. As I mentioned, you can one route to creativity is doing this sort of mixed metaphor where you have these two objects that look similar, and so you just kind of map the behavior of one onto the other. So this is their paper. They go through this, and again, I think that I've seen other versions of this where people are doing using different techniques. So in this paper, they use BERT as the language model, and then they merge this with a vision model. So they use a deep generative model for the images. So they use GANs and variational autoencoders, or VAEs. So those are two state-of-the-art models that you can use to sort of build the visual representation. And so now they're using a textual description of the blend to guide the generation. So they're using the text part to guide what the interpretation of the visual part. So yeah, here's another example in a generative model where you have this example, an avocado that is open like an eye. So you see eyes in avocados. You have bulbs with an ocean in it. A leaf that is glossy like a jewel. So you see a leaf, but you see this jewel inside. A moon that is colorful like a rainbow. Streams of water that form a tree. So you have a stream, but it also forms this tree-like structure, so you can make the connection between this pattern and a tree. So I think in my other group, or in the DeVorm ML curriculum that I mentioned earlier in the meeting, I did a lecture on what is it? Can't remember the name of it now. Pareidolia, which is a phenomena where people will see patterns in things that don't yield the pattern naturally. So, like if you see an image of Jesus in toast, that's an example of pareidolia. And so there's this nice connection between pareidolia and machine pareidolia in particular, which is an actual field of study, and this type of blending. Someone wanted to speak? Okay.
I pressed that on accident.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I just want to make sure. So does anyone have any comment? I have one thing in the chat. Okay, so this is Erin, brainpickings.org. The term bisociation is meant to point to the independent, autonomous character of the matrices, which are brought into contact in the creative act. Okay, so that's a definition from Brain Pickings. And then it's sort of like a quantum comfort conceptually, with the possibility of conflation of self-awareness at the healthiest. Yeah, I think that's true. It's got sort of equal components of like the ability to conflate two things in a way that hurts your reasoning, but it also allows you to combine things to make fluid analogies. So, like you would have like this, it maybe helps you understand the world a little bit better in some ways. If you have like, you can map between two things, or, it's just a matter of creativity. If you map between, say, like the moon and an orange, it allows you to think maybe a little bit more creatively about those things that they have in common. So there are a lot of things that are both sort of good and bad about them, in a lot of ways. So it's but at the best, you're aware that they might not exactly be the same thing, but you get the benefit, the fluidity of blending some of those tools associated. Yes, I agree, Erin. Yes, a very good insight. And so, I think there's definitely, and like I said, there's this phenomenon of pareidolia, and they've replicated it in machines where you basically, this is done with using generative models like GANs, where you can create images that have this sort of nature where you can see patterns in it. The patterns exist, and I mean, our brains will interpret the patterns. Sometimes the machines will interpret the patterns in the same way. So, like, if you see like a ghost in a background of like, you have a fluid simulation where you have a bunch of fluids floating around visually. You can visually identify the overlaps between the fluids, and then suddenly out pops a pattern of like an apparition or a ghost. And the computer will actually identify that as like, something that looks like a ghost, but of course, the computer doesn't know, or the algorithm doesn't know, what it's dealing with. So, I mean, there are things that, versus magical thinking, etc. So it's interesting that we can, simulate these things and start to pull them apart and understand cognition a little bit better. So, So I don't have any more to say about that. I'm going to go maybe into two more papers. We started a little bit late, so I wanted to... So that's conceptual blending, and I'll give you the link to the folder here in a minute. Let me go back. Let me put that in the chat. So these are the papers, and if you need permissions, let me know. Okay. So we have a couple things. Let's see. Let me do this one. It's kind of linked to what we're talking about. This one's called Thinking in Circuits, Towards Neurobiological Explanation in Cognitive Neuroscience. And so this is thinking about the brain in terms of circuits. But that's not something, that's something that we think about in the way the brain works, but that's not the only option. This is just a choice that we make, that we impose upon the brain. So the abstract reads, cognitive theory has decomposed human mental abilities into cognitive subsystems, and cognitive neuroscience succeeds in disclosing a host of relationships between cognitive systems and specific structures of the human brain. So, you can go back to some of the approaches in the 19th century where they were able to actually, they proposed that there were like specific brain regions that did very specific cognitive things, and they had, different little boxes that represented phrenology being one example, where you would have this map of the brain that had these very specific high-level cognitive things in these little boxes. And of course, we know now that that's not true, that there are networks that control these things. So even like, there, the circuit analogy breaks down a bit, because we go from thinking about them as isolated boxes to thinking about them as networks. So, but in any case, if you want to be a reductionist about it, you can think of them in terms of being fundamentally controlled by circuits. And that's how I think the standard in neuroscience is today. However, an explanation of why specific functions are located in specific brain loci are still missing, along with a neurobiological model that makes concrete the neural circuits that carry thought and meaning. Brain theory, and particularly the Hebb-inspired neurocybernetic proposals by Braitenberg. So we've talked about Valentino Braitenberg's vehicles, but he also approaches this from what they call a Hebbian perspective, which is that you have neurons that are connected, and if they fire together, they wire together. And so the circuits are built from like co-occurring activity, and that's how you get circuits And Bradenberg actually, if you read the Vehicles book, it's actually, at once it's emergent, but also very reductionist, because he really does get into the nitty-gritty of the circuits and what those should look like. He reduces a lot of like behaviors, like emotional behaviors, to a very simple circuit. And so it's very interesting. But at the same time, there's a lot of chance for emergence, because you're dealing with, an embodied system, and you have other things that, if the agents interact in groups or together for a long period of time, it can produce other types of behaviors. So brain theory, which is has this flavor to it, now offers an avenue towards explaining brain-mind relationships and to spell out cognition in terms of neuron circuits in a neuromechanistic sense. Central to this endeavor is the theoretical construct of an elementary functional neural unit above the level of individual neurons, but below that of whole brain areas and systems. So this is the network versus the single neuron. And so this level of description is this distributed neuronal assembly or thought circuit. And they've shown that DNA TC theory of cognition, which is this thing that they're proposing, offers an integrated explanatory perspective on brain mechanisms of perception, action, language, attention, memory, decision, and conceptual thought. We argue that DNAs, which is this model, not DNA, carry all of these functions and their inner structure, core and halo subcomponents, and their functional activation dynamics, ignition and reverberation processes, answer crucial localist questions such as why memory and decisions draw on prefrontal areas, although memory formation is normally driven by information in the senses and in the motor system. So they're able to sort of drill down on those sorts of paradoxes. We suggest that the ability of building DNA TCs spread out over different cortical areas is the key mechanism for a range of specifically human sensory motor, linguistic, and conceptual capacities, and that the cell assembly mechanism of overlap reduction is crucial for differentiating the vocabulary of action, symbols, and concepts. So here they're kind of saying that there's the level of the neuron, there's a level of like a network or cognitive network, and then there's this intermediate level, which is this sort of circuit that they're proposing, this thought circuit. And the thought circuit, it does have like a lot of aspects of like this, I guess it would enable blending. It resolves some of the conflicts in what we think about when we think about certain cognitive systems like memory. But we also have this issue of it can actually sort of resolve some of these overlaps and some of these blends in ways that allow us to really kind of sharpen what it's doing to generate thought. So this is an interesting paper. I don't want to get too deeply into it because it's pretty deep. It's pretty dense, but it kind of goes through a lot of the theoretical background of this area in terms of neurocomputation and talking about taking boxes and creating constructs. So you take these boxes, you come up with a theory of how the brain works, and then you distill it into, like in this case, in the case of connectionism, it was creating artificial neuron-like elements. So you create these neurons with these little lines, which are like this supposedly synapses, but it's connection strength. That all comes from a set of boxes and processes. So this is, even a neural network has a sort of level of abstract, it's this theoretical abstraction that, when we don't really think about neural networks in that way too often, but it's important to know that that's kind of where they come from. So this is the thing that they proposed, the circuits for thought thing. And it goes back to Bradenberg and Hebb and some other people who've been thinking about this for a long time. The connection with Bradenberg is particularly interesting, although I don't really have much to say about that right now. So they actually bring up Mars triune level theory too, which is something everyone brings up, but I don't know how. So I would leave it to people if they want to read about it and talk about it next week. We can do that. So what makes cell assemblies especially attractive to cognitive science is the fact that they help solve a range of problems that seem to persist for other neurocomputational approaches. So, for example, concepts or percepts are sometimes represented as activation vectors over neuron populations, but it's well known that this approach runs into the problem of catastrophic overlay, making it inadequate for addressing some relevant cognitive problems. So, yeah, these are the two or more conceptual or perceptual activations would not result in both being active at the same time, but rather compromise average or sum vector, which may be dissimilar to any of the intended representations. So you can see how you have these competing representations, but they have to be sort of normalized in some way. And this theory, I guess, does this better than other theories. So, let's see, I don't want to get into that too much, but let's see. I talked about this one, and I just want to go through this one really quickly. But this is the universal visitation law of human mobility. So this is kind of moving from the brain to this sort of idea that you can have these universal laws across different systems, and that they're these broad sort of explanatory frameworks. Sometimes they're mathematical laws that describe this, and this this is, I guess, in like complexity theory, it's kind of a given. Outside of complexity theory, like in neuroscience or more broadly in society, it's maybe a bit more controversial. But we'll talk about this universal visitation law, and this actually goes back to observing mobility in humans and animals, observing how they move around in space. So like road networks and how people walk across the commons at a university, or how cities are designed. So this is Jeffrey West, who does a lot of work with scaling. He's at the Santa Fe Institute, and a bunch of other people who, So let's get into the abstract. Human mobility impacts many aspects of a city, from its spatial structure, like the road networks and other things, how things are laid out, to its response in an epidemic. It is also ultimately a key to social interactions, innovation, and productivity. However, our quantitative understanding of the aggregate movements of individuals remains incomplete. Existing models such as the gravity law, or the radiation model, which are kind of like models of what's the path of least resistance, or if you take a model of random diffusion, where do people end up? So you have both gravity, where people are drawn to something based on its ease of access, or radiation, which is kind of a random diffusion across space, just kind of people moving out and seeing where they end up. Those kind of models concentrate on the purely spatial dependence of mobility flows, and do not capture the varying frequencies of recurrent visits to the same locations. So they don't take into account the human behaviors, or the sort of the cognitive behaviors of moving around space. Maybe if a squirrel is caching its nuts somewhere and they want to visit those locations again and again to check on them, it doesn't account for that. Here we reveal a simple and robust scaling law that captures the temporal and spatial spectrum of population movement on the basis of large-scale mobility data from diverse cities around the globe. According to this law, the number of visitors of any location decreases as the inverse square of the product of their visiting frequency and travel distance. So this is sort of a probabilistic model where you just have your number, you take this aggregate measure of the number of visitors, you find the average, it decreases as their visitation frequency and travel distance increases, and so there's this law-like relationship between those two. We further show that the spatio-temporal flows to different locations give rise to prominent spatial clusters with an area distribution that follows Zipf's law. So Zipf's law, if you've heard of power laws, it's similar to that. They use this in linguistics, but it can also be used to look at like distributions of these spatial clusters. Finally, we build an individual mobility model based on exploration and preferential return to provide a mechanistic explanation for the discovered scaling law and the emerging spatial structure. Our findings corroborate long-standing conjectures in human geography, so central place theory, and Weber's law of emergent optimality, and allow for predictions of recurrent flows, providing a basis for applications in urban planning and traffic engineering and mitigating epidemics. So this is the paper here. They kind of show so the scaling law is basically this linear relationship between two variables. If you see like the number of visitors per kilometer squared, that has some relationship to the kilometers per period of time. And so you have this, and you can see this across different locations on Earth, different cultures. It's invariant in that sense, and it follows a scaling law. And this is their whole theory, is that you can use these scaling laws to understand cities of different design, different layouts and different cultures and different places. It's just what matters is like the sort of the needs of the individuals, how they kind of diffuse themselves across space. And there may be different designs to the cities in different layout patterns, as you can see in these examples, but they basically generate the same type of behavior. So you have the number of visitors on this axis versus the distance per visitor traveled, and so you can see that they're similar patterns. And so this all comes from a power law of this form, so it's a very simple equation. We actually talked about this a couple weeks ago with respect to the theory of data science. These are mini theories that I proposed. So these little mini theories describe a lot of your data, and you can put these together in a certain way and get more insight into what's going on in your data. So this is So this is the paper. And again, they compare the gravity model, the radiation model, and then this scaling law. And they show the results, and the scaling law is much more consistent with this linear trend. So that's the paper. And it doesn't look like we have any questions about that, unless we do. Now's your chance. Otherwise, if there are no questions about that paper or the other paper on brain theory, then I wonder if we have any questions, comments, generally.
I don't have any questions, but those are all cool papers to go over. This is every week, but I kind of want to go back and read them. But yeah, that was good.
Thanks. Yeah.
All these papers are in the Slack, right?
What was that?
All these papers are in the Slack, right?
Yeah, well, I put them in the Slack. They're in this folder that I put a link to here, but I'll put them in the Slack as well.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, well, I think that's it for this week, unless we had any other comments or questions. I know that Erin, we're trying to catch up with you on the Trajectories stuff, so let us know when a good time for you is. I know this weekend is not good because of the holiday, and it's but we want to, our session is at the end of the month, so we want to make sure we kind of get things squared away on this by then. And we're still planning out, so Jesse is updating the website as we speak, and we're kind of getting things in order. And we already have 12 people signed up, so maybe we'll advertise the session a little bit more as well. I think that would be good.
My sync there. I have a really important update, actually. And by the time my voice you can tell it's not that important, but I'll be discussing this meeting with Anson over fish and chips in the near future, hopefully. It's kind of funny because there's a group chat on the side that some of us are in, and it was like, Anson's like, hey, you want to get fish and chips? Well, I got to finish the lab meeting first, but so let it be known that the lab will be discussed over fish and chips in the UK, and that's a cool thing. Maybe we'll take a picture of weekend or something.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah, please do. All right. Yes, thank you, Erin. And Erin says how very British of you. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for attending, and catch up in Slack. If you have any questions, I'll put the papers in there, and have a good week.
All right.
Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you. Bye.